Well, thank you very much. So I will be the person who's in your way of actually getting home or getting dinner tonight. So I'll try to keep it informative, and I think we're going to leave the question for the end. Although I like this forum more, if we could do it more interactively. But so I'll have to excuse myself for this. So I got asked to speak on rehabilitation in rare immunologic diseases. It's a really tough one, because if anybody here who has some experience with rehabilitation knows it's a huge topic. And we could probably spend several days talking about this. And I'm going to try to put this into 45 minutes or shorter. All right, so the big question is, what are we going to do once the injury has occurred? So we heard everything today, this morning, now how does it happen? And what are the symptoms? But now the big question you always get is, what are we actually going to do? And you heard Maureen Mealy speaking earlier today. You just heard Dr. Harden speaking today. One of the big things that everybody has as a common denominator is be physically active. And we're going to talk a little bit about why does that make a difference. So if you look in the dictionary and you see, what's the definition of neurorehabilitation? So it's a complex medical process which aims to aid recovery from a nervous system injury and to minimize or compensate for any functional alterations resulting from it. It's very long. So the question is, after you had the injury, what can we do to help you A, adjust to the injury, and B, is there actually a way of getting better? And for the second part of the question, I have to defer a little bit to tomorrow. So it's going to be one of the last talks of the day tomorrow, so I want you to stay here. So if you want to hear a little bit more details about what can we do to actually restore function. But we're going to have a little bit today. So the rehabilitation itself doesn't have to be complicated. So if you had an injury, it doesn't always mean you have to have a physical therapist, an occupational therapist, or a speech therapist on hand. Sometimes it can be very, very basic. So it could be regular exercises, which could mean you walk as simple as 20 minutes every day, or if you're in a wheelchair, you wheel yourself in 20 minutes a day. Spasticity is one of the biggest problems. I don't think we've had a dedicated talk earlier today. Stretching these spastic muscles. So any muscle that gets stiff needs to be stretched. And I encounter this all the time in my clinic when people come to me and they're in certain positions, and I ask, so how often do you stretch? And they say, well, I don't know, probably never. And what happens is, for example, if you keep your muscle, let's do it just for the biceps, if you're sort of in this position at all times, over time, that muscle will start getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And if you really try to straighten this part out later on, you won't be able to. And the big goal in all of this is we're trying to repair the nervous system, right? And so we're trying to keep our body in the best possible shape that once we actually get to the point that we can repair, that you can still do everything. If your arms and legs are kind of crumpled up like this, even if the cure comes around for this, or when the cure comes around, we can't do anything. So you want to avoid these complications from happening. Stretching, the simplest, cheapest advice. And the big question always comes then up is, so how do I stretch these muscles? And so I can give you some basic answers in the clinic, but where you find the best stretching exercises? On Google, yeah. So you pick your muscle. You say, I want to stretch my calf muscles. And you put in calf muscle stretches in Google Images. And you get huge pamphlets, pictures of any kind of ways you can stretch these muscles. Put your foot against the wall, kind of doorstep. Anybody who's sitting trying to stretch hamstring muscles. This is when people sit in wheelchairs. The knee is always bent, and then the leg might not stretch out anymore. So what's the easiest way to do this? So when you come home in the evening, you put your heels up on a chair or on a couch, and you still see it might be a little bit bent, and then you put something slightly heavy into your lap to kind of stretch this. So this could be your pet. Hopefully you have a big enough pet that can actually stretch. Or your significant other. Get some mutual benefits out of this. But these are very simple interventions. And of course, keeping a healthy weight. And that's something easily said, but it's very hard to be done. So keeping the healthy weight always brings down a question, what are we going to do with nutrition? And I'm not sure if we're going to hear about this at this meeting. Then, my father always used to say, weight is it's physics, right? It's energy in versus energy out. So if you have a way of exercising a lot, there's a lot of energy going out and you can eat more. But if you don't have that way, you have to kind of make sure on the income side you don't overdo it. So very, very basic. And then if the stuff that you can do on your own is not enough, and in many instances it's not, then you need help from a professional who does rehabilitation. So these are usually physical therapists, occupational therapists. Does anybody in here know what the basic difference is between a PT and an OT? All right, we're not going to get into that battle. So generally, if you can think about it, if it has something to do with generally with the upper extremities and tasks, functional tasks, that's the occupational therapist. And if it's more related to mobility, walking, then usually a physical therapist is involved. But if you can't find an occupational therapist, doesn't mean that now your arms have to get lost. There are lots of physical therapists who can do similar things. They may not be as good as the occupational therapist, but they can help. And so in a traditional way in rehab, how it used to be addressed is what can we do to help you adjust to your new disability? Meaning now you have difficulty walking. Do you need a cane to make this safer? Do you need a walker to make this safer? Will you need a wheelchair? Kind of really trying to adapt to your new disability to make it safe for you to get around. Because sometimes gait safety is one of the biggest things, because any fall can cause fractures. Fractures set you back. We don't want to see those. And then you want to learn sort of appropriate coping and compensatory strategies for the weakness. So if you're having a weak right arm, what can you do to overcome this? Do you just use the left arm for this task? If your balance is bad, what could you use to get better, to improve the balance, or to offset that problem? They will also help you with helping strengthen those muscles, and this could be traditionally with just weights. This could be with electrical stimulation, with electricity on the outside of the muscles. And then they also focus very big on maintaining the range of motion in all joints. And we talked about this, why it's important. And it doesn't mean just because you go to a physical therapist today and you see him next week again, that you don't stretch because they do this once a week. You stretch. Does anybody know how many times we usually say to stretch for everybody? How many times a week? 7? No, more. So it's usually at least 2 to 3 times a day, everyone. Okay, keep those muscles stretched out. All right, so for the traditional strengthening, we talked about weights, we talked about little bands that people can use. We talk about FES, so functional electrical stimulation devices, which is essentially electricity applied to the weak muscles. And that when you turn these devices on, they can make the muscle contract. And over time, they will actually build muscle mass. There are walking systems, different ones, from simple ones where your physical therapist suspends you in a harness and moves your legs around, to robotic systems where a computer does it, to functional electrical stimulation devices. All kinds of different systems are out there that kind of sort of simulate walking in a rehab setting. You can not only do this with walking, you can do this with bicycling, you can do this with rowing. Then there are certain biofeedback devices. Has anybody ever seen those? Where they're most commonly used by the urologists for like pelvic floor exercises. Where you can you put electrodes on and you can activate these muscles and you actually get to see how you activate and train this muscle. It can be very powerful. And then one of my favorites, gravity eliminated strengthening. So that means aquatic therapy. So a lot of people can't do things on land, but they will be able to do this in the water. And whoever has heard or seen what we've been doing with our patients from time to time knows that I love the water for my patients. So underwater, essentially everybody is equal. So you need very little strength to actually move a muscle. And you might actually be able to see certain things underwater that you can't do on land. I hear many times of somebody with, for example, acute injuries where they say, I can't do walking. It just hurts my hips, hurts my back. I can't do this, so I'm going to need to sit down. I say, well, that's not an excuse. Because what are you going to do if I'm going to take you into the water? all is different. You don't get the impact on your knees. You don't get the impact on your hips. And then with the water, you can play. Because if you put the water level up to your neck, right, you have very little, there's lots of buoyancy and very little impact on the legs. As you get stronger, you're going to start dropping the water level. And the lower the water gets, the more you have to use your lower limbs. And when you do that, you strengthen it up, and hopefully you can drop the water level low enough at some point that you can actually get out of the water. It's almost like evolution, right? All right, so, and then physical therapy is also there, and occupational therapy, to help with secondary complications. So if contractures have happened, so if the muscles are kind of stiff, they can't get out, what can be done to loosen this up? And for example, in cooperation with a physician, like a physical medicine and rehabilitation specialist, a physiatrist, you can use maybe interventions like Botox and strengthen out these muscles, splinting devices to get this out. Foot drop devices we hear about all day long. So we talk about AFOs, or ankle foot orthoses. These are the little things that keep your foot off the floor, so that you don't, when you walk, you don't trip. And there are different ones out there. There are the classic ones out there that are the big all plastic guys. Then you get the more pretty ones. They are out of carbon fiber. You barely see them. Then you get the more electronic fancy ones. There are electrical stimulation devices that are attached to your ankles. There's not one fits all. So this is where you need the specialist who tells you, okay, this is the device for you. So this is where they come in. And then, we talk about the stretching programs. So then we're going to talk about non-traditional rehabilitation. And that just came up over the last 10 or 20 years. And I'm a very big fan of this. So it's called recreational therapy. Who has ever participated in kind of recreational therapy? One person. Wow. Well, so actually, we could probably do a whole talk about this next time. Has anyone ever participated in recreational therapy? Okay, good. 2, 3. All right. I couldn't have left a big impression if you forgot about it. So in this case, you actually use recreation, because if you go in a physical therapy gym, this can be quite boring and sterile and not so much fun. But if you take therapy outside of the physical therapy gym, into nature, into an environment that you like to participate in, then you can essentially achieve similar effects, but with much more fun, and you'll participate more and with much more effect. It's a little bit more involved, and the magic word for this is essentially adaptive sports. And this is always an interesting thing when people come into my office and they say, well, I can't, I used to ski, I can't do this anymore, I used to golf, I can't do this anymore, and life as I know is over. And then I have to say, wait, this is absolutely wrong. If you can think of a sport, it has been adapted. So I started looking into this several years ago, and I was amazed, because we started with an aquatic program, which is essentially a scuba diving program, and then this evolved into adaptive horseback riding and rafting, and I think the latest one we just did was surfing. I have a couple of pictures, next slide. So ultimately, you're trying to achieve the psychological and physical health and recover in well-being, which helps pretty much the whole spectrum we talked about, your spasticity, your fatigue, your depression. It's makes a huge impact. And these are not stock photos. These are actually pictures from our patients that we do over the years. So you can go adaptive horseback riding. And most states, and especially out here, I'm sure there are a bunch of horse farms where you can do that. We go to Colorado, we go rafting, we go in a canoeing. The bottom right, you might recognize the lady. She is right over there in the corner. She just participated in our first surf camp that we did at Virginia Beach. You can go scuba diving, skiing, snowboarding. Any sport you can think of, you can do. And there are organizations out there all over the United States. They can help you with that. And if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to get you in touch with some of them. All right. So ultimately, but you see the common denominator here is exercise. Maureen said it earlier, Dr. Harden said it, exercise, exercise, exercise. Because ultimately you get all the benefits of it. Now, you reduce the fatigue. You make sure that your bone health improves. If you put strength on the bones, they are less likely to lose their calcium. So you're less likely to get osteoporosis, which is something that happens commonly after injuries to the central nervous system. Bowel and bladder function generally gets better. Endurance gets better. And thinking gets better. So we always recommend to our medical students when they come by, so if you want to study, you're going to exercise. Because people who exercise study better. There's actually the little nerve cells, we're going to look at them in a second, little neurons born in an area of the brain called the hippocampus. And that responds very well to exercise. So the more exercise, the more it's probably going to help your cognition as well. Right. So now the question is, how can we make exercise more effective? And so we have learned this over the years. If we add what's called an activity-based rehabilitation program, then we can do that. And essentially what we've been talking about until now is kind of the traditional approach in rehabilitation, in a very short period of time. So why do we want to add an activity-based therapy program? Because the big answer always is our nervous system is trying to repair at all times and it never stops. So commonly I get this in transverse myelitis and NMO patients coming to me to say, I've had this 5 years ago. Somebody told me, whatever recovery I had for the first 6 months, 12 months, that's it. Stop worrying about it, that's there. And when I went to medical school, might date myself too, like Ben earlier. I was taught that the nervous system is static. So you were born with a set of cells, and we're going to die with the same amount. And if something happened, maybe some other ones take over, but nothing really gets repaired or born. And that's absolutely not true. While we're all sitting and standing here, we are making new cells in our nervous system at all times. And the brain a little bit more than the spinal cord, and I'm going to show you the tools that we have here. But ultimately, you're making those cells. You don't have to go to Portugal. You don't have to go to South America. You don't have to go to anywhere. These cells are in you, and these cells can repair. Okay, and this is what they look like. So when we talk about repairing the nervous system, and it's going to be a little bit more about this tomorrow, and the tools that we're looking at, there are 3 major cell types. There are neurons, which are essentially the cables of the nervous system. These are the ones that connect your left brain, right brain, and all the way from the brain down to the spinal cord. Then we have the insulation around those cables. That's done by the oligodendrocytes, or oligos, much easier to remember. You see there's a little star-type cell on the bottom left. And then we have astrocytes, which are essentially the cells that are providing the structure in between, provide nutrition to all the systems. So if we can show that we can fix that we can reproduce those, we generally have regeneration, right? So the first picture we just saw, these were cells that were taken in the culture dish. So what we did, we actually removed stem cells out of somebody's spinal cord and grew them in a dish. And so you could actually see you can grow all 3 of these cells, all we need. So this picture now is those stem cells actually in real life. When they're not in a dish, they don't look quite as pretty. Do you remember the first one looked very, very smooth? This one is more the real life pictures in the spinal cord. And you see all the way on the left, that's the true stem cell in the spinal cord. That's a cell that can essentially become a neuron, the cable, an oligodendrocyte, the insulation, or an astrocyte, which is the support structure. And then as they get older or they differentiate, they become, they lose some of these properties, so they can't become anything anymore. They sort of differentiate down a tree. So then they can become oligodendrocytes, insulators, or astrocytes, the support structure, and then you see the adult versions of that on the right. So ultimately, we've been able to show that these cells all are there. Those stem cells are in you, and they're able to grow all the way into adult cells. So this is what they look like from the bird's eye view in the spinal cord. These little tiny white spots, these are those stem cells after they had freshly divided. And if we look in the spinal cord in the cross-section, where those arrows are, this is where we mostly found those cells. So as you can see, they kind of grow all over the place. So they are there. So the next thing is we know that these guys are born at all times. They, in the brain as well as in the spinal cord. The problem we have in the spinal cord, we haven't been able to show neurons, meaning the cables, to be born. But we've been able to show that those cables, after they got cut, trying to make new connections. So this is called sprouting. So after you cut off that arm of that of the neuron, it's trying to reach out and try to make a new connection. That's what we call sprouting. Most of the brain cells, the nerve cells, neurons, are born in the brain, usually the hippocampus and the olfactory bulb. Hippocampus was the structure that was important when we talked about memory and thinking. Next big concept is how much repair do we actually need? So here you see a picture of somebody with a lesion in the cervical spinal cord. That's an MRI. You see C2 is his cervical 2 body, then C3 is the third body, vertebral body in the neck, then C4 and C5. In the middle, the black stripes, these are the discs. And then you see behind it is this gray stripe coming down from the brain. That's the spinal cord. And what we ultimately like to see on MRIs is that it looks boring. The more boring the MRI looks, the better. But here you see it's not quite as boring, and I helped you a little bit because I put a little square around the problem. So you see this little white spot. So that's the white spot where that person had inflammation. So you would think now, considering that up here is the brain, this is the spinal cord, which is the long cable that connects your brain with the rest of your body, and you have a fairly large little white spot there in the center, that this might be, how much function would that person have? The number one big lesson to learn for here and any kind of medical student who's in here, the MRI means absolutely nothing. So I can show you this picture of a person who is completely quadriplegic, can't move their arms or legs with that picture, and I show you the same picture with somebody who's fairly normal. You can't see anything on the outside. That's not everything right. So MRI means nothing for that. But what we have also learned is, how many of these connections do we need to actually walk? So if, let's say we have about 100% of our connections connecting our brain to the spinal cord, how many do you think you need to walk? 1%? Wow. 90%? 20%? 50%? All right. So we could almost, we're going like a bingo card here. So in animals, it's about 18 to 22%. In humans, it's probably a little bit less. We think it's probably like in a 10 to 15% range. So that essentially means we do not have to repair the whole spinal cord, right? We just have to repair just a tiny little bit, and we will get a disproportionate amount of return of function. And so we know that in these lesions, where inflammation has happened in TM, and well, in NMO as well, that the big injury is mostly a demyelination, where the insulation is sort of ripped off the cables. And so if we just can give just a little bit back, we can actually get a lot of return for just a little bit of repair. So we don't have to cure for any of this, but we can help you kind of help your body repairing itself. All right. The other fun question to the slide is, so do you need a brain to walk? Do we need our brain to walk? She said the chicken does not. Okay, and that's a good. And that's a very valid point. Because if anybody who has been to a farm might witness when a chicken by accident loses the hat, They can actually run, and they can walk, they can fly, right? They stop doing this after they run out of oxygen, essentially. But ultimately, the program for walking is in our spinal cord. It is not in our brain. So it's a little subroutine. It's called the central pattern generator. It's in the lumbar spinal cord. And all the brain has to do to this little computer in the spinal cord has to tell it, start walking, stop walking, go faster, go slower. That's all the brain does. That's why we probably don't need to repair all these connections. Because if you know that the computer is down in the lower part of the spinal cord, we just need to get the cables that sort of activate and deactivate the system. That's all we need for walking. All right, so we talked about our brain and spinal cord has a large pool of stem cells that can repair. And the other concept we haven't talked about yet is when the nervous system develops, so when we are in utero, and all these eyes develop, limbs develop, the connections all develop, and even after delivery, the brain keeps making connections at all times, it starts making a lot of connections and it starts pruning some back. And it decides who is going to stay and what we need and what we don't need based on what circuits are active. So the active circuits will be maintained and they will be strengthened, whereas the inactive circuits will be pruned away. And the same thing still happens later on. So our nervous system needs to stay active in order to repair. If it's not active, the system sort of thinks, oh, we don't need this, and it starts putting it away. So activity is one of the key issues. And that's why we keep bringing this in home and all the patients when we talk, be active, be active, be active, because these connections need to be maintained. So if we look at this in a very basic way, so here's a picture of a part of the spinal cord. You see the gray part is the cable itself. Does anybody remember what is the cell type that makes the cable? The neuron, right? So the neuron makes the cable. That's the gray part. And then the insulation, the myelin, is sort of depicted here in yellow. It looks like a little yellow hot dog bun. And then what cell type is the one that makes the myelin? The oligodendrocyte, correct. So that's the O cell, the oligo. And then we have another picture in here. We have these all stem cells that we said are always there to sit around and wait if they are needed. So that's sort of a steady state part. So if in an acute demyelination injury, we kill off these oligos, what happens? The oligo disappeared, and the insulation to these nerve cables disappears. And so what happens now, the electricity from one end of this cable can't travel directly past this bare part of wire. It's like in your house. When you have when we used to run telephone wires, and you had to make sure that each one of these cables is perfectly insulated, right? If the dog or the cat started chewing on it and ripped it off, then either couldn't make a phone call at all, or it really started crackling and lots of static. Same thing in the nervous system. If you take that insulation off, you either don't make a call, so it doesn't connect at all, or there's a bunch of short-circuiting, you get pain, you get maybe some movement. This is sort of what you see here. So now what should happen is this. These little stem cells that are sitting there are supposed to know that they are needed over here. So they have to move over there. So once they are there, they're supposed to now figure out, oh, I need to become an oligodendrocyte because now that one is missing here. And so then they become oligos. And then once they are an oligo, then they still have to decide, what am I doing now that I'm an oligo? So they have to look around and see, oh, you know what? There's those wires I need to insulate. And then they reach out and insulate. So that's what should happen. So if we have all the tools, and you would think we have these tools, this is what we should see all the time. But unfortunately, what happens instead is this. So those stem cells are still smart enough to know that there's a problem. So they are able to recognize that we have to move to the side of the injury. And unfortunately, this is all they do. So they're all going to be there. when you do autopsy studies in people with these lesions, you see that these scars surrounding those lesions are lined with tons of stem cells. They just sit there. They just don't know why. So we all got called into this room, and we don't know why we're here, right? So it took a couple of years to kind of figure out, what is the signal that these guys need to do their job right? Because they used to be able to do it, well, they can do it in a dish, and they used to be able to do it when we initially developed, right? So turns out, if the connections that they're supposed to fix are not actively firing, they can't see them. So essentially, we're all in this room, and we don't know why we're here. But now, if you find a way of lighting up these cables that go sort of vertical through this room, and suddenly we said, oh, now we can see them. That's why we're here. And now we know this is what we need to do. Now we need to become oligos. And by the way, how many arms does an oligo have usually? Does anybody know? It's like 40 to 60 arms. So they reach out and grab as many cables as they can. That's why with just killing one of these oligos, you really cause a lot of injury. So now we all oligos, we're sitting in here, we see these cables, and now we know, oh, they're all lighting up, we need to fix them. And that's where you get the repair. And the way we have learned to activate these cables is exercise. Is exercise and combining it with a little bit of electricity called functional electrical stimulation. So exercise itself is good, but it's not enough. So that's where we need you to go. This is where you probably need help by a physical therapist. So if you look at this at a graph, you see on the x-axis we have activity plotted, on the y-axis we have regeneration plotted. So the idea is the more activity we put into the system, the more regeneration should occur, right? So this is what it should look like. So you would think that we put more activity in, and then we're going to reach probably a peak or sort of an optimum, and maybe at some point it's too much activity, and then things might get worse again. If you add, I'm going to talk about this a little bit in a second. If we add electrical stimulation to this, or functional electrical stimulation, we can actually make this a lot more effective. So we are down here after the injury had occurred, and we're trying to push this little red dot up the hill. If it's just exercise, you will probably end up here. If we add exercise with electrical stimulation, it goes much higher up. So now the big question that's going to come up here, and I'm going to try to answer this before you ask it. How much is too much? Right? And we hear this all the time. Somebody who hasn't, let's say you had an injury 4 or 5 years ago, even 10 years ago. And somebody says, oh, you heard this talk, oh, Dr. Becker said I should exercise. Now you go out, and tomorrow you completely pooped out. It's like, oh my God. I meet you again in 3 weeks. You say, you know what? I tried this. It made me worse. So you can't start like that. So you have to have a slow, escalating exercise program. And you can actually push this up the hill very slowly. We try to find these limits. So we did research backwards. So we put this into our therapy gym in action. So we used more and more electrical stimulation with our patients and see who did better. And essentially, the more we made them do things, the better people were off. So we couldn't find when did they get worse again. So we thought, well, if we can't do it in people, let's see if we're animals. So we put electrical stimulation devices into animals and started stimulating them as much as our animal use committee would allow us. Because, even animals have rights. That's important. And so we tried to kind of push this all the way of what we could do. Same thing, we looked into their brains and spinal cords. The more we did, the more effect they had. We couldn't find the top number. I thought, well, if we can't do it in people, we can't do it in animals, let's do it in cells. So we planted these cells out in the dishes, like what we looked at earlier, and started stimulating more and more and more. And with cells, we don't really have the restrictions. You can do this 24/7. And we haven't really found that peak number either. So I still believe that there is probably a peak somewhere, but it's practically unreachable. So don't let anybody talk you into that. You can't do certain things. Just keep on pushing. Just do it slow. Because if you really just overdo it, then you will pay for it. And you will find your optimum for yourself. There's not just one for everyone. I have some patients coming to me, and I always tell them, you make look everybody bad because they work this 7 days a week. And I think I only have 2 and I follow a lot of patients. But most people can achieve some sort of an exercise program at least 3 to 5 times a week. And I always say, I'm going to show you the data tomorrow, 3 is sort of the magic number. So people who drop below 3 of these sessions per week don't get the benefits from it. But if you were to aim for 3 times a week, you will never achieve it, right? So if you say you're going to exercise 3 times a week, that's 1 day a week, I don't know, something came up. And so I always say you should aim for an exercise program that's at least 4 to 5 times a week, because now you have a real chance of hitting 3. That's where you need to go. So, and don't set yourself up for failure if you say you want to do 7 days a week. Nobody can sustain that. That's why even in our clinical trials, we generally do not test 7 days a week, because if I had to tell you should do this 7 days a week, you would not be happy camper. And so I'm going to get back to that slide tomorrow afternoon as well. So this is data that was derived from the multiple sclerosis population. So in MS, and this is function plotted over time, in MS we generally see that if over time you have relapses and people lose function and things generally keep going sort of downhill. And if you always decline, it's not hard for me to predict that where you are today, 2 years from now, you're going to be worse than today. That's natural progression, and there was nothing we had found yet to kind of offset that. Except when we added an activity-based program to this, so the use of exercise plus electrostimulation, there was a 75% chance of people actually not changing, meaning staying the same for the next 2 years. And that was huge. If for any person who doesn't have MS, they don't, well, what do you mean? I'm not getting any better? But if your natural progression is getting down, if I just keep you steady for the next 2 years at least, that means you're gaining, because that's all this part on the curve. So it was a 75% chance. There was actually a 25% chance of people getting better. So that's actually possible as well. So, and it makes no sense now that you know everything about the cells that we need for repair, and you know that they all need activity. And as we feed this in, it should actually help with the repair itself. So how does one of these programs look like? And Dr. Cabo, who's in the room as well, I saw her earlier, she's also an expert in those. So at first, we start with an evaluation by the physician and combine it with the evaluation by the physical therapist or occupational therapist. Then we put our heads together, and we're trying to figure out what's the right program for that person. And we bring them into therapy, and we spend a good several weeks together and figure out what are the right exercises, meaning which muscles are weak, what exercises you are actually able to do, figure out what's the right electrical stimulation equipment that works for you, because there's no one fits all. And then we design a program for you with the exercises, electrical stimulation equipment, teach you how to use it, and then you ultimately go home with it. So it becomes an in-home activity-based program. Because this is not something you just come to a center somewhere and spend a couple weeks, and then we're going to say, good seeing you, let us know if you have any problems. You have to kind of implement activity like you would take a pill for high blood pressure or like you would take a pill for your diabetes. That's the same way you have to put in activity into your nervous system. So then you spend a couple months at home on your own, and they usually bring you back and update this program to your newest levels. Because as you change, people generally get better. You have to update it to your goals. Oh, it brings me up to goals. So if you ever see a physical therapist, the most important thing for you to do when you see him for the first time is what? Give him goals. That's right. Because the physical therapist will look at you, and if you don't give him or her your goals, then they're going to impose their goals on you. And they may not mean anything to you. That's why if you want to spend time with them and you want to get something out of it, you think about this up front and you say, so what's the thing that makes the biggest impact in my day-to-day life for the in the near future? And this can be very different, depending on what your level of disability is. And then you give them the list and you prioritize the list. I always say put 5 to 10 things on there in order of importance. The therapists love it. Any therapists in here? occupational therapy, right? But same thing. You know, you want the list of goals, and then they will also help you sort of refine those goals a little bit. You know, what's achievable in that time frame of the next bout of therapy. Not everything will be achieved in your first bout. So then you go home with the program, and you come back with a new set of goals. You know, say, okay, this worked, this didn't work. You need to help me update this program. So same thing. You update this program over some period of time. You go home with it again, and then sort of the process repeats. And ultimately, you would like to have a full physician supervision with that. So where somebody actually looks at, you know, your other complications like spasticity, like pain management, fatigue management, bowel management, bladder management, all the fun little things that can happen after having had an injury to the central nervous system. And so I always explain to the patient that, you know, my job is the job of the therapist is to give you the best possible rehab program for you right now. And my job is to make sure that you're medically up to date for that, so that you don't get any kind of complications. So if you find this in a place, that's perfect, because then you have sort of an all-round supervision of your therapy program between physical therapists, occupational therapists, and the rehab physician. And that gets me to the end of my talk. So, exercise. Thank you.